I once learned that self-control is the strongest form of power, because when you can control your mind, nothing outside of you can truly control your life. You think you need peace, but the truth is, you're addicted to chaos. You say you want a calm mind, a stable life, a sense of control in every situation. But when things finally slow down, when silence appears, when nothing is demanding your attention, you feel uncomfortable, almost restless, as if something is missing. And without even realizing it, you reach for your phone, you overthink a conversation, you replay a mistake, you create tension where none existed. This is where most people misunderstand calmness. They believe calm is something external, a quiet room, a stress-free job, a perfect relationship. But calmness is not the absence of noise. It is the absence of internal resistance. And that is something most people have never trained. There's a reason why, in the middle of an argument, your voice rises before you can stop it. There's a reason why a small inconvenience can ruin your entire day. There's a reason why, when pressure builds, your thoughts become louder, faster, and more chaotic. It's not because you're weak, it's because your mind has been conditioned, not for calm, but for reaction. Think about it. Every time something goes wrong and you immediately respond with frustration, you reinforce a pattern. Every time anxiety appears and you try to escape it, you teach your brain that discomfort is dangerous. Every time you let your emotions dictate your actions, you strengthen a loop that becomes harder to break. And over time, this loop becomes your default state. Not calm, not grounded, but reactive. But here's the part that most people never stop to examine. Your reactions are not random. They are trained, rehearsed, repeated so many times that they now feel automatic, like a script your mind follows without asking for permission, which means something important. If your mind can be trained to panic, it can also be trained to stay calm. But that process does not begin where most people think it does. It doesn't begin in the middle of chaos. It begins in the quiet moments you usually ignore. The moments where nothing forces you to react, but your mind still searches for something to hold on to, something to worry about, something to control. Because calmness is not built in extreme situations. It is revealed in them. And what gets revealed is whatever you practiced when no one was watching. So before we talk about staying calm in every situation, we need to look at something deeper, something most people avoid. Why does your mind resist calm in the first place? Because once you understand that, everything else starts to change. Why does your mind resist calm in the first place? Because calmness feels like a loss of control, even though it's actually the only form of real control you'll ever have. Most people don't realize this, but the human mind is not designed to seek peace. It is designed to detect threats, to scan for problems, to anticipate what could go wrong. This made sense when survival depended on reacting quickly to danger, but in the modern world, that same mechanism turns inward. It no longer just protects you from the outside, it creates storms within you. So when things are quiet, your mind doesn't interpret that as everything is okay. It interprets it as you might be missing something. And that subtle shift is enough to trigger a chain reaction. A small thought appears, then another, then a scenario, then a fear. And before you realize it, you are no longer sitting in peace. You are sitting in a story your mind created. There was a man named Daniel who worked in a fast-paced corporate environment. Every day was filled with deadlines, pressure, constant communication. He used to complain about how stressful his life was. He would tell himself, if I just had a break, if things were calmer, I would finally feel at peace. One year, he got exactly what he wanted. A long vacation, no emails, no meetings, no expectations. The first 2 days felt amazing. But by the third day, something strange happened. He started checking his phone constantly, even though there was nothing urgent. He began thinking about work problems that didn't exist anymore. He replayed old conversations. He even created imaginary scenarios about what might go wrong when he returned. Nothing around him had changed, but inside his mind, chaos had returned. And that's when he realized something uncomfortable. The stress was never just in his environment, it had become part of his identity. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. A philosopher once suggested that humans suffer more in imagination than in reality. And if you observe your own mind long enough, you'll start to see how true that is. The argument you're preparing for hasn't happened. The failure you fear hasn't occurred. The judgment you anticipate exists only in your thoughts. And yet your body reacts as if it's all real. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your breathing changes. Your body does not know the difference between a real threat and a rehearsed one. And this is why calmness feels so difficult. Because you're not just dealing with reality, you're dealing with a mind that continuously simulates problems, and a body that responds to those simulations as if they were real. But here's the shift that changes everything. You don't need to control every thought that appears in your mind. You only need to change your relationship with those thoughts. Because the moment you stop treating every thought as truth, it starts losing its power. But that's easier said than done, especially when you're in the middle of a situation that feels overwhelming. When emotions rise faster than logic, when your instinct is to react, not observe. So the real question becomes, what actually happens in that exact moment when everything starts to spiral? Because if you can understand that moment clearly enough, you can begin to take your power back from it. It never begins with chaos. It begins with a moment so small, you almost never notice it. You're standing there, or sitting, or walking, and something happens. Maybe someone says something you don't like. Maybe a plan changes unexpectedly. Maybe a message arrives with a tone you can't quite read. And in that exact instant, before any visible reaction, something shifts inside you. A thought appears. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, just a subtle interpretation. This is not good. This might go wrong. I don't like this. And that thought is the spark. Now imagine this like a scene in a film. There's a character named Alex. He's in a meeting. Everything is going fine until his manager suddenly questions his work in front of others. The room goes quiet. No one says anything. And on the outside, Alex remains still. But inside, something has already started. His mind whispers, "You're being judged." Then another voice follows, "You're losing respect." And before he can even process what's happening, his body reacts. His chest tightens, his jaw stiffens, his thoughts accelerate. He starts preparing a defense, not because the situation is out of control, but because his interpretation of it is. Now here's the part most people miss. The situation itself is neutral. It's just a question, a moment, a few words spoken in a room. But what turns that moment into stress, into anxiety, into anger, is the meaning assigned to it. And that meaning happens fast, almost instantly, so fast that it feels like reality, not interpretation. I once came across an idea from a thinker who suggested that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies your freedom. At first, this sounds simple, almost too simple. But when you observe closely, you realize how rarely people access that space. Because most people collapse it. They remove the gap entirely. Stimulus happens. Reaction follows immediately. No pause, no awareness, no choice. And that's why calmness feels impossible in the moment. Not because you lack strength, but because you were never trained to see the space. Now let's go back to Alex. In that meeting, there was a fraction of a second where he could have noticed what was happening inside him. He could have observed the first thought without attaching to it. He could have allowed the feeling to rise without immediately acting on it. But he didn't, because like most people, he was trained to react, not to observe. And this is where everything begins to change. The goal is not to eliminate the first thought. You can't. It will appear automatically, instinctively. That's how the mind works. The goal is to interrupt what happens next, because the first thought is just a suggestion. It's what you do with it that creates your reality. But here's the challenge. When emotions rise, awareness tends to disappear. And if you lose awareness, you lose choice. So the question is no longer how do I stay calm? The real question becomes, how do you stay aware exactly when you need it the most? Because once you can do that, calmness is no longer something you chase. It becomes something you access. There's a belief that most people carry without ever questioning it. A belief so subtle that it hides inside everyday language. It sounds like this: I couldn't control myself. As if in certain moments something else takes over. As if calmness disappears and leaves you helpless inside your own reactions. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You didn't lose control. You followed a pattern perfectly. A pattern you've been practicing for years. Most people think calmness is about being naturally composed, about having a personality that doesn't get affected. But calmness is not a personality trait. It is a trained response. And just like any trained response, it comes from repetition, which means something most people don't want to hear. If you panic easily, it's not because you're broken. It's because you've rehearsed panic more times than you've rehearsed calm. Now pause for a second and really think about that. Every time something stressful happened in your life, what did you do? You reacted. You worried. You overanalyzed. You tried to control the outcome. And each time you did that, your brain learned something. It learned that this is how you deal with pressure. This is your normal. So the next time pressure appears, your mind doesn't ask what to do. It already knows. This is what people misunderstand about emotional control. They try to change their behavior in the middle of chaos, without ever training their mind outside of it. It's like expecting yourself to stay balanced during a storm when you've never practiced standing still on a calm day. There was a woman named Elena who struggled with anxiety every time she had to speak in public. Before every presentation, her thoughts would spiral. What if I forget what to say? What if they judge me? What if I fail? And as those thoughts repeated, her body followed. Her hands would shake, her voice would tighten, her breathing would become shallow. She believed the problem was the situation, public speaking, the audience, the pressure. But over time, she began to notice something different. Even when she was alone, just thinking about an upcoming presentation, the same reactions appeared. The same tension, the same fear. Nothing was happening, yet her body was already responding. That's when she realized something that most people never fully accept. The situation is not creating your reaction. Your mind is rehearsing it, long before the situation even begins. And this is where the shift starts. Because if your mind can rehearse anxiety, it can also rehearse calm. But here's where people go wrong. They think rehearsing calm means forcing positive thoughts, telling themselves everything will be okay, trying to suppress fear. That's not training, that's resistance. Real training looks different. It means sitting with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. It means noticing your thoughts without believing every single one of them. It means allowing your body to feel tension without labeling it as danger. And at first, this feels unnatural, even uncomfortable, because you're breaking a pattern your mind is used to. But this is exactly the point where change begins. Now here's something deeper to consider. Most people don't actually want calmness. They want control over outcomes. They want certainty. They want guarantees. But calmness doesn't come from controlling the outside. It comes from no longer needing to, and that's a completely different way of living. So the question is not, how do I stop feeling anxious? The real question is, are you willing to sit with discomfort long enough to teach your mind that it's safe to stay still? Because that is where calmness is built. Not in the absence of pressure, but in your response to it. Let's strip this down to something raw, something most people avoid admitting. You don't react because the situation is overwhelming. You react because you've never learned how to stay when things feel overwhelming. There's a difference, and that difference changes everything. Most people live their entire lives escaping internal discomfort in subtle ways. not always through obvious distractions, but through reactions. Anger becomes an escape. Overthinking becomes an escape. Even urgency becomes an escape, because as long as you are reacting, you don't have to sit still and feel what's actually happening inside you. Now imagine this as a quiet moment. No chaos, no pressure, just you, sitting alone. At first, everything feels normal, but then a thought appears. Something unfinished, something uncertain, something uncomfortable, and almost instantly your mind tries to do something with it. Solve it, fix it, push it away, replace it, anything but sit with it. And this is where the training begins, not in the loud moments, but right here, because calmness is not built by controlling your thoughts. It is built by changing how you respond to them. So let's walk through this differently, not as theory, but as practice. Step 1 is noticing without interference. When a thought appears, your instinct is to engage with it, to follow it, to analyze it. But what happens if you don't? What happens if you simply notice it, the same way you would notice a sound in the distance? At first, it feels unnatural, almost like you're ignoring something important. But if you stay with it, you begin to see something subtle. The thought doesn't hold itself. It fades if you don't feed it. Now here's the paradox. The more you try to control your thoughts, the more persistent they become. But the more you allow them to exist without reaction, the less power they have over you. Step 2 is allowing the body to feel without labeling. Most people don't actually fear situations. They fear the sensations those situations create, the tightness in the chest, the heaviness in the stomach, the tension in the shoulders. And the moment those sensations appear, the mind labels them as danger. But what if they're not? What if those sensations are simply energy moving through your body? There was a time when a man named Victor used to panic every time he felt his heart race. He believed something was wrong, that he was losing control, but over time he began to experiment with something different. Instead of resisting the sensation, he stayed with it. He observed it. He allowed it to rise without trying to stop it. And something unexpected happened. The sensation peaked, and then it passed. Not because he controlled it, but because he stopped fighting it. Now pause here for a moment and consider this carefully. What if the intensity you feel in stressful situations is not the problem, but your resistance to it is? Because resistance creates friction, and friction amplifies everything. Step 3 is staying longer than your impulse. Every emotional reaction has a lifespan, but most people never see the end of it. Why? Because they act before it completes. They speak too soon. They escape too early. They distract themselves before the feeling has a chance to dissolve. But if you stay just a little longer than your instinct tells you to, something shifts. You begin to realize that emotions are not permanent. They move, they change, they fade. And in that realization, you gain something powerful. You gain distance. Distance between you and your reaction. And that distance is where calmness lives. But here's the part most people struggle with. Staying in that space feels uncomfortable at first, because you're no longer following your pravichka, your automatic response. You're interrupting it. And anything unfamiliar feels difficult in the beginning. But difficulty is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're doing something different. And that difference is exactly what retrains your mind. So the next time you feel that urge to react, to escape, to control, pause. Not to suppress, not to fight, but to observe. Because in that pause, you are no longer the person who reacts automatically. You are becoming the person who chooses. And that is where real calmness begins to take shape. Most people think calmness is about controlling the outside world. Fix the situation, change the outcome, avoid the trigger, and if none of that works, then try to control themselves. But real calmness begins in a place most people overlook. It begins in how you observe, not what you see, but how you see it. Because the same situation can create two completely different internal experiences, depending on the lens you're using. Imagine this: Two people are stuck in traffic. Same road, same delay, same noise. One of them grips the steering wheel, checks the time every few seconds, feels irritation rising with every passing minute. His thoughts spiral. I'm going to be late. This is a waste of time. Why does this always happen to me? The other person sits in the same car, in the same traffic. But something is different. He leans back slightly. His breathing stays steady. He notices the delay, but he doesn't resist it. There's no internal argument, no urgency forcing itself into his body. The situation is identical, but the experience is completely different. Now here's the question that matters. What created that difference? It wasn't luck, it wasn't personality, it was perspective. A shift so subtle, yet so powerful, that most people never consciously develop it. There's an old idea I once came across, suggesting that suffering doesn't come from events themselves, but from the meaning we attach to them. And when you really observe your life, you begin to see how often this plays out. You're not stressed because something happened. You're stressed because of what you believe that event means, and beliefs can be questioned. This is where calmness becomes something deeper than just emotional control. It becomes a way of seeing reality. Let's break this down in a way you can actually apply. Step 1 is separating facts from interpretation. What actually happened? And what did you add to it? Someone didn't reply to your message. That's a fact. But they're ignoring me is an interpretation. They don't respect me is another layer. And before you realize it, your emotional state is no longer based on reality, but on a story your mind created. Now here's the shift. When you catch yourself inside that story, ask a simple question. Is this true, or is this my interpretation? That question alone creates space, and space creates calm. Step 2 is zooming out of the moment. When you're inside a stressful situation, everything feels immediate, urgent, important. But what happens if you step back just slightly? Will this matter in a week, a month, a year? Most of the time, the answer is no. But your mind doesn't operate on long-term perspective by default. It operates on immediate reaction. So you have to consciously introduce that distance. And when you do, intensity starts to soften. Now here's something deeper to notice. Calmness is not about making everything feel small. It's about seeing things clearly, without distortion. Because sometimes situations are serious. Sometimes they do matter. But even then, panic doesn't improve your response. It only clouds it. There was a moment in my life where everything seemed to stack at once. Deadlines, expectations, uncertainty. And I remember feeling that familiar pressure building inside me, the urge to rush, to react, to fix everything immediately. But instead, I paused. Not for long, just long enough to notice what was happening inside me. And in that pause, something shifted. The situation didn't change, but my relationship to it did. I stopped seeing it as something attacking me, and started seeing it as something in front of me, something I could face, one step at a time. And that's when I understood something important. Calmness doesn't remove challenges. It removes unnecessary suffering around them. Now, before we go further, there's something you need to see clearly. Even when you understand all of this, there will still be moments where you forget, moments where emotion takes over, moments where reaction feels automatic again. And that's not failure. That's where the real work begins. Because the goal is not perfection. The goal is awareness, returning faster each time. So what happens when you're right in the middle of that internal conflict? When one part of you wants to stay calm and another part is already reacting? That's where the real battle takes place. Not outside, but within you. There is a moment, right before you react, where two versions of you exist at the same time. One is quiet, observing, aware of what's happening inside. It doesn't rush, it doesn't panic, it simply sees. The other is loud, urgent, emotional. It wants to respond immediately, to say something, to do something, to escape the discomfort as quickly as possible. And most of your life, that second voice has been winning. Not because it's stronger, but because it's faster. Now imagine this as a conversation happening inside your mind, not metaphorically, but literally. You're in a situation. Someone says something that triggers you. Instantly, the emotional voice speaks. Say something back. Don't let that slide. And before you even process it, your body is already preparing to act. But then, something different happens. A second voice appears, quieter, slower. Wait. That's all it says, just one word. And for a brief moment, everything pauses. This is the space most people never notice, because it's so small and it disappears so quickly if you're not paying attention. But if you catch it, even once, you begin to realize something powerful. You are not your first reaction. You are the one who hears it. Now let's go deeper into this conflict. The emotional voice is not your enemy. It's a pattern, a conditioned response built over years of repetition. It's trying to protect you in the only way it knows how, by reacting quickly, by avoiding discomfort, by controlling the situation. But the problem is, it doesn't know when it's no longer needed. It reacts the same way to a real threat and to a minor inconvenience. And if you never question it, it becomes your identity. I'm just an anxious person. I'm just short-tempered. I'm just not good under pressure. But those are not identities. They are habits, and habits can be changed. Now here's where the internal dialogue becomes important, because the calm version of you doesn't fight the emotional one. It doesn't suppress it. It doesn't try to eliminate it. It listens without obeying. Let's return to that moment. The emotional voice says, react now. The calm voice responds, I see what you're doing. There's no resistance, no force, just awareness. And that alone begins to weaken the pattern, because patterns need unconscious participation to survive. The moment you become conscious, you interrupt them. Now here's something subtle but critical. Most people think they need to win this internal battle every time, that they need to always choose the calm response. But that's not how this works. Sometimes you will react. Sometimes the emotional voice will take over before you can catch it. And in those moments, the old pattern will play out again. But here's the difference now. You will see it. Maybe not in the moment, maybe right after, but you will notice. And that awareness is progress. Because every time you see the pattern, you create a small separation between you and it. And over time, that separation grows. The reaction slows down, the pause becomes longer, the calm voice becomes clearer, until one day, in a moment that used to control you, you don't react. Not because you forced yourself not to, but because you no longer needed to. And that's when you realize something most people never experience. Calmness is not something you apply, it's something you become. But there's still one piece missing, because staying calm is not just about what you do in the moment. It's about what you believe about discomfort itself. And if you don't change that, you will always feel like you're fighting against your own mind. Most people don't fear chaos. What they truly fear is discomfort. And until you understand this clearly, calmness will always feel like a struggle, like something you have to force, something unnatural, something that goes against your instincts, because in a way, it does. Your mind has been trained to interpret discomfort as a problem, something that needs to be fixed immediately, something that signals danger, and the moment that signal appears, everything inside you mobilizes to escape it. But here's the truth that changes everything. Discomfort is not the enemy. Avoidance is. Let's look at this differently. Imagine someone who goes to the gym for the first time. The muscles burn, the body resists. Everything feels uncomfortable. Now, if that person interprets the discomfort as harm, they stop, they avoid it, they tell themselves it's not for them. But someone else walks into the same experience and sees it differently. They feel the same burn, the same resistance, the same tension, but they interpret it as growth, as progress, as something necessary. Same sensation, completely different meaning. And because of that meaning, completely different outcome. Now apply this to your mind. Every time you feel anxious, tense, overwhelmed, what if that's not a sign that something is wrong? What if it's simply a signal? that you are facing something unfamiliar, something that requires your attention, not your escape. There was a period in my life where I tried to eliminate every source of stress. I structured my days to avoid pressure. I controlled my environment as much as possible. And for a while it worked. Everything felt manageable, predictable, safe. But something strange happened over time. My tolerance for discomfort decreased. Things that used to feel small started to feel overwhelming. Situations I could handle before suddenly felt heavy. And I realized something uncomfortable. By avoiding discomfort, I had trained myself to be weaker in the presence of it. That's when the shift happened. Instead of asking, how do I avoid this feeling? I started asking, how do I stay with it? And that question changed everything. Because the moment you stop running from discomfort, you begin to understand it. You begin to see that it rises, peaks, and then fades. You begin to notice that it doesn't actually control you unless you let it dictate your actions. And slowly, something inside you starts to change. The same situations that used to overwhelm you begin to feel manageable, not because they became easier, but because you became more stable within them. Now here's something deeper to consider. Calmness is not the absence of intensity. It is the ability to remain steady within intensity, which means the goal is not to remove discomfort from your life. The goal is to expand your capacity to hold it without breaking. And that brings us to something most people never train: acting regardless of how you feel. Because it's one thing to stay still when discomfort appears. It's another thing entirely to move forward while it's still there. And that is where calmness turns into power. Because now you're not just someone who can observe your emotions. You're someone who is no longer controlled by them. But this transformation doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments, small ones, repeated. And sometimes it happens in ways you don't expect. Like a story that changes how you see everything. There was a man named Adrian who prided himself on being in control. On the outside, his life looked stable. He handled pressure well, made rational decisions, rarely showed emotion. People described him as calm, collected, unshaken. But that wasn't the full truth, because what no one saw was what happened when he was alone. At night, when everything went quiet, his mind didn't slow down. It sped up. Thoughts he had suppressed during the day began to surface. Doubts, regrets, unanswered questions, and without the distractions of the outside world, he had nowhere to run. So he did what he had always done. He tried to control it. He analyzed every thought, tried to solve every feeling, tried to think his way out of discomfort. But the more he tried, the louder it became. One night, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but just enough to change the direction. Instead of fighting his thoughts, he stopped. He didn't try to silence them. He didn't try to replace them. He simply let them be there. At first, it felt wrong, almost irresponsible, like he was giving up control. But then something unexpected happened. The thoughts didn't multiply. They didn't intensify. They passed. Not instantly, not perfectly, but noticeably. And in that moment, he realized something he had never understood before. Control was never about forcing the mind into silence. It was about no longer needing to. Now here's where the lesson deepens. Because Adrian didn't suddenly become calm in every situation after that night. He still felt stress, still experienced pressure, still had moments where his mind reacted automatically. But something had changed beneath all of that. He stopped fearing his own mind, and that changed how he showed up in the world. There was a moment not long after, during a high-stakes meeting, where everything started to go wrong. Miscommunication, tension, unexpected problems stacking one after another. In the past, this would have triggered the same internal chaos, the same urgency, the same need to control everything immediately. But this time, something was different. The pressure was still there, the discomfort was still present, but instead of resisting it, he allowed it. He noticed the tension in his body, the thoughts trying to speed up, and instead of following them, he stayed. He spoke slower, listened more, responded instead of reacting, not because the situation demanded calmness, but because he had trained himself to remain steady within it. Now pause here for a moment. What changed? Not the situation, not the pressure, but his relationship to what was happening inside him. And that's the shift most people spend their entire lives chasing without realizing it. You don't become calm by eliminating chaos. You become calm by no longer being disturbed by it. And that doesn't mean you feel nothing. It doesn't mean you detach from reality. It means you stop amplifying what's already there. You stop adding resistance to discomfort. You stop turning moments into problems that don't need to exist. And slowly, your mind begins to settle. Not because you forced it to, but because you finally stopped fighting it. Now there's one final piece to understand. Because calmness, at its core, is not just a skill. It's a decision. A decision you make again and again, in moments where it would be easier not to. And when that decision becomes consistent, it becomes who you are. At the end of everything, calmness is not something you find. It's something you choose, in moments where no one sees the choice. Not in the big situations, not in the obvious challenges, but in the small, quiet moments where your mind begins to drift, where a thought starts to pull you, where an emotion asks you to react. That's where the decision happens. And most of the time, it doesn't feel like a decision. It feels automatic, привычно, like you're just being yourself. But now you know that version of you was trained, which means it can be changed. There's a moment that will come again and again in your life. A moment where something unexpected happens, where pressure rises, where your old patterns begin to activate. Your heart rate shifts, your thoughts accelerate, your body prepares to react. And right there, in that exact moment, you will have two paths. The first is familiar, immediate reaction, following the thought, escaping the discomfort, saying something you don't mean, doing something you'll later question. The second is quieter, almost invisible. A pause, just long enough to see what's happening inside you, just long enough to realize that you don't have to follow it. And in that pause, you reclaim something most people give away without ever noticing: your power to choose. Now understand this clearly. You will not always get it right. There will be days where you forget everything you've learned, moments where emotion takes over before awareness arrives, times where you fall back into old patterns without even realizing it. And that's part of the process. Because calmness is not built through perfection. It is built through returning to awareness, returning to observation, returning to that space between what happens and how you respond to it. Every time you come back, even after reacting, you strengthen something inside you. Not control, but clarity. And over time, that clarity becomes stability. Now here's the final shift. Most people wait to feel calm before they act calm. But it works the other way around. You act calm, even when you don't feel it. You slow down your breathing when your body wants to rush. You stay silent when your impulse is to speak. You observe when your instinct is to react. And as you do that, something begins to rewire. Your mind starts to learn a new pattern. A pattern where discomfort doesn't lead to chaos. A pattern where pressure doesn't lead to panic. A pattern where emotion doesn't control action. And eventually, that pattern becomes natural, not forced, not practiced. Just who you are. So the next time life puts you in a situation where everything inside you wants to react, remember this: calmness is not the absence of intensity. It is the presence of awareness within intensity. And that awareness is always available to you, not somewhere far away, not in a perfect future version of yourself, but right here, in this moment, waiting for you to choose it.